I see South Africa has been getting a lot of attention lately. Since I spent my childhood there as a Slavic immigrant at the tail end of the apartheid, I thought it would be interesting and informative if I gave my 2 cents on the topic. Before I comment on the farmer murders and the expropriation of land without compensation that most reporters are focusing on right now, I'd like to start with a bit of a history lesson through my own experience and memories. One of my earliest memories from South Africa was being shown to a hotel manager in order to prove my parents aren't Indian, because the hotel booked by the orchestra my father was going to be playing for was whites only. Something you'd learn very fast in late 80s, early 90s Durban, that's the city we lived in, was that there are 3 South Africas. One for white people, one for black people, and one for everyone else in the middle. I remember blacks did all the housework, manual labor, low-paid jobs, and weren't allowed to get out of the position they were in because the education they were allowed wasn't as good, the jobs they were allowed to take were low-paying ones, and the neighborhoods they were allowed to live in were all segregated and poor. You know the oppression feminists and intersectional pro-black people are constantly harping on about? That's what blacks in South Africa were living under, in their own lands, nonetheless. Because I was just white enough to get into the good kindergartens and schools, I had a few really close white rich Boer friends. A memory that stuck with me is the time we sneaked into the outhouse where the black servants lived to see the new baby the woman that cooked for the family had had. Yes, they lived in shacks in the backyard and were allowed in the house only to do their respective job. So, when we got caught there, we got yelled at, told how dirty these people are and how we might catch some illness if we ever went back there, as if they were rabid dogs or something. Based on that, you can probably figure out how most whites treated most blacks by yourself. Now, a side effect to rampant racial segregation is that it teaches everyone to discriminate on appearance first. I had a horrible time in both kindergarten and school because I was never white enough for the white kids or dark enough for the Indian kids. My skin was definitely white enough, but my brown hair and brown eyes would stick out like a sore thumb when I was around my few white friends with their almost white blonde hair and bright blue or green eyes. The older I got, the worse it got. In school, I was called names and got bullied for not fitting in any racial group, and I was considered white. I can only imagine how the browner and blacker people around me got treated. Going back to the bigger picture, I remember how Mandela got in office. I remember watching the vote on TV, being told some blacks couldn't write or read, so instead of signing their name, they'd leave a fingerprint. I remember the fear in one of my best friend's father's eyes. That same year, they sold everything, the land, the house in Pretoria, the business, the house in Durban, and left for Australia. That winter, my mom came back to Bulgaria and took me with her. I believe with that first big wave of white immigration from South Africa, the wealthiest Boer families left the country before the 90s were over. Fast forward about 10 years, it was the early 2000s, and I was a teen. I remember asking my dad, who still lived in Durban, if I can visit him sometime. I missed Africa, I missed the climate, I missed eating ripe, sweet grenadilla, which you just can't get here. I missed him, and he told me no. He told me that as much as he loved me and wanted to see me, he couldn't risk having his teen white daughter in South Africa at this point in time. He explained it's getting progressively dangerous living there. When he visited that year, he told me that stopping at a red light in certain neighborhoods without locking your doors and windows is very dangerous, and how one of his close friends lost his car and almost lost his life that way shortly before moving to the UK. My dad, even though he had made a living for himself and owned property and a business in South Africa, chose to move to England around 2006 and then back to Bulgaria a few years later. Him, the not quite white enough Eastern European immigrant, stopped feeling safe there more than 10 years ago. What I'm trying to say here is, this problem you're just now discovering exists is decades old now and is bigger than black people are killing white people in South Africa. On that point, I really feel like I need to add this in so people don't get the wrong idea. South Africa's crime rate doesn't discriminate. It's dangerous for everyone there, no matter what skin color they were born into, especially if they're female. There's a very strong case to be made for the link between poverty and violence, so my guess would be that that's the root of the problem with all kinds of violence in third world countries, and it's just way more noticeable in South Africa because it used to be a wealthier, thus safer country. Also, chaos always follows when oppression is over. Same thing happened in Bulgaria after communism fell, even though it was to a much smaller extent. The country went through a period of skyrocketing crime rates that took about a decade, maybe even two, to go down. So, what's the point of this long story time I put you through so far? Well, 1, to remind everyone who seems to act oblivious to the fact that, yes, the apartheid happened and started in 1948, and that's if we decide to pick the legislative prohibition of mixed-race marriages as a starting point. The de facto racial stratification in South Africa started way back in the late 18th century during the Dutch Empire and ended in 1994. Let me repeat that for the people in the back. We're talking your lifetime, 1994. So, before anyone goes off and starts moralizing the South African government for wanting to strip white Afrikaner farmers of their land, take the time to appreciate the years of oppression these people have gone through for generations. Now, to be clear, in today's civilized world, I do not condone neither the ethnic cleansing that's obviously going on, nor the forcible taking of land that's been in some families for generations. But I understand. And this is how we segue to the second point of this video. It's precisely because I understand I'm telling all of you European and North American moralizers, waving a finger at the black people of South Africa will do nothing to stop the murders or better the racial relations in the country. The only reaction you'll get for doing this is, where were all these human rights defenders and moralizers for the past, 100 years? When our people were treated like shit? Where was your concern for racial justice then? Why did it take till fucking 1994 for the world to notice what's going on in Africa? The few South Africans I've talked to on Twitter who support their government's decisions tell me they see what multiculturalism and racial diversity has done to Europe and don't want that in their country. What I think would be way more effective in ending the violence in South Africa right now is a concerted international effort to, first of all, get all whites wanting to leave out of the country as soon as possible, and 2, speak to the self-interest of the people and government of South Africa, and shift their focus from getting justice for the past to working together in rebuilding the country in order to get a better future, because the infrastructure is already there. The largest amount of capital has left the country a while ago, yes, but the natural resources of the land are rich enough to turn it into a prosperous nation within a few generations, if only priorities shift from the past to the future. And I know it probably sounds like I'm saying ignore the crimes committed and help them get rich, but no. What I'm advocating for is doing something that will work and benefit all sides involved, because given the history of the conflict, there is little that can be done now without it being extremely hypocritical. Hope you found this video informative and that it gave you a new perspective to consider on the topic of South Africa and the news that's coming out of there. Make sure you click all the clicky things and check out the rest of my channel. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day!